Hi, folks. Welcome in. We'll get started in just a moment. Welcome to our webinar. It's brought to you by Cure. As always, if you've been with us on our other data center webinar videos, you'll know that the recording is going to be available in the coming days. And we're going to try our best to have a Q&A session at the end. But I think we're going to have a really robust discussion. So feel free to put your questions in the Q&A function as well as we go along. We've got a couple folks watching the Q&A, so we'll do our best to answer as we continue on. But again, we're hoping to have a time for a Q&A at the end. And of course, as always, information provided to you is for your own use, but it's not legal advice. If you do need legal advice, get a lawyer who can represent you. And please do check out our other webinar series if you haven't already. We'll put that link in the chat as well, so you can just click it and go to it directly. And I think we'll get started. All right, so welcome. This is the last of Cure's Data Center webinar series. I hope you've been able to watch our other ones. If not, they're available online. We recorded them, as I just said. This one is about community benefits. I think this is going to be a really great discussion. I know this is a big topic, especially here in Minnesota, as local governments are being approached by data center developers wanting to locate in their communities. So if you aren't familiar with us, Cure protects and restores resilient communities and landscapes by harnessing the power of people who care about them. We are rurally based. We've been working on data center issues for about a year and a half now. We're working at all levels from the local government to the state. And I'm often at the Capitol doing data center work. So our work does, of course, require funding. So if you're able to, we would appreciate any support you're able to provide. Let's jump into what you're here for. So today we're going to be talking about community benefit agreements. I'm Sarah Mooradian, the Government Relations and Policy Director for Cure. I'm really just here to provide the intro and also to help moderate some of the Q&A at the end, so you won't be hearing too much more from me. You're really going to be hearing from my colleague Hudson Kingston, our legal director at Cure, and our great guest speaker, Sarah Friedman, who's the co-founder of the Better Data Center Project. I think I'll hand it over right away to Hudson then.
Very excited to have Sarah here. And for folks who have attended our other webinars, this is going to be a slightly different format. I'm going to be asking Sarah Friedman a series of questions. She, as a co-founder of the Better Data Center Project, is a highly qualified attorney and former government employee at the Department of Energy, who will be able to talk to us about what a data center is, what a community benefit agreement is, why they may be good tools, why they may not be good tools, which is an important thing to know, and other things. But yeah, to the extent that you'd like to talk about it, Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about Better Data Center Project
Sure.
and sort of what you're up to there?
Yeah, thank you so much. And really excited to be here today. The Better Data Center Project was formed in 2025, so less than a year ago, by former federal workers who wish to continue public service. And so we provide basically tailored pro bono services to communities at the front line of data center build out. And that includes project specific technical support and research on things like air quality and water and cost causation and energy. And then also creating factual science-based materials to, there's a lot of disinformation and misinformation. We try to provide factually based information. And really kind of working to identify and socialize what best practices might be across environmental, social, and environmental aspects of data center build out. I will say we are a very young and new organization, and we get a ton of technical assistance requests. I think at one point it was about 4 to 5 a week. And I say that just because I think it's really important and a note about the scale and speed of this type of development and how it's impacting just communities all over the country. I feel like we're often asked, where is it happening? And you can say one place and then you say, but also it's over here too. And it looks really different. And the stories are different and yet the same. I feel very privileged to have that perspective and to be really kind of able to see what's happening on the ground in different communities. At this point, we have, in some level of support and capacity, about 30 plus volunteer experts. So feel really privileged about that as well.
Awesome. Yeah, and we're so excited to have you and your expertise here. I know that Better Data Center Project just put out a report on diesel generators, which I think we'll share in the chat. And, I wish the one thing that unified these projects wasn't diesel generators, but I think if I had had a resource a year ago on that topic, I would be better for it. So I'm so happy that you're here and working on this important stuff. I'm going to launch in with some very general questions because maybe everybody who's here today hasn't been to our other webinars, and we'll ease into this topic and get on our way to talking about community benefits. So first of all, what is a data center? And more specifically, is a data center the same as like a warehouse or an office building, or is it more like a mine or an oil refinery? How do you think about data centers in terms of their size or overall impact on environment and communities?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. And I think one that folks who haven't been engaged so much on the front lines might not see. I think a data center is really more akin to an extractive, high resource intensive use, like a mine or an oil refinery. And that really is for a few reasons. They're extraordinarily land, energy, and water intensive. The acreage they take up, which is most often open space of some sort of habitat or conservation or agricultural value. The scale of the energy use, we're seeing data centers, and I know that you are in Minnesota as well, that really are using the same power as a small city. And water use as well. I think we're hearing something like 5 million gallons a day just for cooling. So not even for the indirect energy use. And I think that's also akin to a small city. So I think it's really important to keep in that perspective. They might look like warehouses, and they might from externally, but really they're more akin to a pretty long-term mining operation.
Awesome. Thank you. How big of a deal is the hyperscale data center build out to our economy in like, the next few years?
I think you can answer that question a few different ways. I think right now, as we're seeing on the ground, it's really what is driving or was driving our GDP growth. I live in California, and I think our recent budget legislative analysis, we would not be surviving as a state without AI right now and the tax revenues there. But what that means on the ground is not that we're all really capitalizing or benefiting in the same way that we might have with some past economic development trends that we might have seen. What we're seeing on the ground is we have an unprecedented build out of these really large hyperscale data centers to meet pretty massive compute demand. So we're seeing a lot of construction occurring. And then I think at the same time, we're seeing stagnation in the job market, um, layoffs, and a slowdown in hiring and I think it's hitting certain sectors earlier than others. And I think what we're also seeing, and this is tied to our economic future, is really just like the role that they're playing in fossil fuel build out and how that is affecting, folks' energy bills and also air quality and all the other things.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, on the point of stopping coal plants from retiring, we're in Minnesota, so a lot of coal plants in North Dakota that serve Minnesota customers are were slated to shut down and are now being re-upped for decades, potentially if they can find data center customers. So yeah, we're definitely seeing that here. It's not just in California. So another basic question, who wants these? Are the developers usually patient companies that are, willing to work out a really good project? Do they operate with a lot of transparency? What's their normal MO?
So I think you can answer this question really well, Hudson. But I think one of the trends I think there's a few different trends we're seeing that are playing off in a way on the ground that is really harmful to communities. So the first is what they call speed to power. So I think in the race against a few big players in how to build out AI and really who's the winner or loser in this space, there's really kind of like a massive trend to build more data centers with more compute fast as possible. And I think what this looks like to communities on the ground is an increased use of non-disclosure agreements, which I think Sarah Mooradian and others can really talk to, and some trends we're seeing, and the protection as trade secrets, certain kind of information that's really just sort of like basic community data, like how big will it be? Will it get a tax break? How many megawatts of energy will it use? That should be pretty basic information, but is protected, and I think that's a trend that started, perhaps around this increased competition between certain companies, but maybe has just kind of snowballed from there.
Yeah. So say a project is hiding behind NDAs and like you don't know how much water it's going to use and don't know how much energy it's going to use, but you know it's probably a lot. Um, can communities trust that kind of development? Can they require that information be public? I guess how does a community deal with a developer that doesn't want to tell you any of that stuff?
I mean, I think those are kind of two different questions. Like, if I've worked separate sides of infrastructure development over the years, and I will just say, from the perspective of being a new use, moving into a new community to build trust, it's not a good practice. It doesn't really get you on the right foot with your host community and build that kind of relationship that you might want to see long term. In terms of what communities can do about it, I mean, I think there's some really great trends starting to come. I think in Minnesota, I've heard there's some good legislation moving forward. There are also communities are moving, a lot of things forward in this space through local ordinance. Those might not be data center specific, but they might say things like, large water users over a certain size or industry coming into our community. This sorts of, our local officials cannot protect these types of information as trade secret. So there's definitely, and again, in a community agreement, it could be one thing, I think, not so much at the front end, but perhaps moving forward, really ensuring that there's robust monitoring and transparency and that data is shared with the public. So I would just say there's two aspects, there's multiple aspects to transparency, but one is like the pre-development stage and a lot of secrecy there, which I think to some degree is not always unique. We often have special purpose entities or project companies that are coming in, and that's just sort of the structure of project finance. This increased use of trade secrets at the get-go as these companies are competing with each other and often putting in applications in multitude of local governments or in utility or transmission planning processes. So that's one piece. And then I think the second piece is, what are they going to do once they're in construction, development, and operation? How are they going to share this key data that affects communities' resources?
Yeah. Yeah, so you talked just now about the possibility of local regulation or local transparency efforts. Uh, Overall, have you seen a shift towards regulation or deregulation? And maybe speak to like the federal level. Are the rules getting tighter on these types of developments, or are they getting looser?
So I think that this use in this technology development really happens to be happening at, I think, the very worst possible time, as we know. So I think that's one thing to think about. This is these developments in a new use, in an impactful new use at a scale we haven't seen before, is moving forward in a climate that is already deregulated. So we have our federal government who has eviscerated most of our environmental laws, human and health protections, consumer protections. We have at the same time a lot of state houses pushing for streamlining of energy projects or of data centers or of transmission in kind of an abundance mindset for how we build faster. Um, and then we also have another unfortunate trend, which is really austerity. So the federal government cutting, the funding that it was giving to state and local governments means that our state and local governments, particularly local governments, have very little capacity to respond to this new type of use and to provide that oversight. At the same time, the states don't really either. So I think it's kind of a perfect storm of streamlining, deregulation, and austerity measures. And a worry I think that we're starting to see is combined with that austerity measures that are affecting like individuals who might see, food and medical benefits tied to work requirements and the slowdown in work. And then the governmental austerity is that local and state governments are pretty desperate for economic development. And so some of these deals that might not otherwise seem so attractive are very attractive at the moment because there isn't a lot of other economic development moving forward.
Yeah. Yeah, it's tough. It's a rock and a hard place for a lot of local governments for sure. And then one more sort of basic question before we get into community benefit agreements. When a developer claims, as they have in Minnesota, that they're going to bring a bunch of they're going to invest in some clean energy. They say they're going to invest in, 300, 400, 500 megawatts of wind energy or something like that. But they don't commit to powering the facility with only clean energy. What effectively does that mean? Are there any examples of that happening in other states, and how were those facilities powered?
I think there's a few, yeah, I think there's a few different kind of trends and flavors of what that can look like. First being, again, we're moving not just in a deregulatory environment, but a really pro fossil fuel environment from our federal government. So they're pushing for that. Um, and so a lot of companies or that had previously made corporate commitments or project level commitments to power their data centers with renewable energy are now quietly sort of dialing those back. So for example, we work with a community in Jackson, Mississippi, and there's a bunch of Amazon data center projects there. And, one came in and there was like a lot of excitement and public statements from Amazon and the local utility that they would be using 100% renewable energy made in solar in Mississippi. And then, kind of really without ever acknowledging this, that wasn't going to happen. There is now a gas plant big enough to power a city 4 times the size of Jackson, just feet from homes and businesses in Jackson solely to power an Amazon data center. So I think that's an extreme example, but I think, a lot of, I think what we always really want to see is 24/7 renewable energy that really is additive and it benefits communities, the grid, and data centers. And we're moving more and more away from that through a variety of factors.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you for that. I mean, I think that it's important to have this background of what we're dealing with, and you covered so many topics, really across all of the previous webinars that we did. So thank you for that grounding in sort of what we're dealing with, the scope of the issue and the complexity of the issue. So with all of that said, on to today's topic, what is a community benefit agreement? And I guess also implicit in that question, what is it not? What does a community benefit agreement do? What can it not do?
Yeah, so a community benefit agreement at its heart is just a really simple tool. And that simplicity is both its beauty and perhaps sometimes its downfall. So in essence, it's an agreement between a developer and hopefully a coalition of groups or that outlines basically the benefits that the developer will provide to the community or community groups for the consideration of giving up their legal claims. So, for folks who might be unfamiliar with the term, but you may be lawyers and you have done a pre-settlement agreement or a settlement agreement, that is really the heart of it. Like, we will give up our right to sue you. And that could be a spectrum of we'll actually support your project or do certain affirmative things in return for certain concessions that we'll get that will make their project better, will serve our community. I think one of the unique things about a community benefit agreement is it doesn't really have a legal definition. So it's not tied to project mitigation. So you don't have to say, like, for example, this was a solar project, so it impacted this resource, we'll have to get this. It could be like, it can really be centered in community needs. So if a community says, like, what we really need is a grocery store, that's okay. That's great. And some of the other, but on the other hand, given that there's a lot of power dynamics at play, both in this agreement generally, and then in today's scale and time, what we can also get is like, wait, you built a $20 billion project and I just got a food pantry, something like that. So I think some other key things that are just sort of like core to what it is a best practice is that it's legally enforceable by all parties. And it's also the terms of it are incorporated into a development agreement, a permit, a land use approval. So it's not just enforceable by the community group, but optimally by the local government as a term of the permit or condition. Um, and they've increasingly been used for urban development, I'd say over the last 20 years, and then energy and infrastructure projects. As you know, kind of, I think, particularly with the Biden-Harris administration, Department of Energy, there was a lot of focus on this tool and others as a way to ensure that host communities that might have been left behind in the past were getting some of these benefits.
Yeah, and let's pursue that a bit. So Kier definitely knows about community benefit agreements in the context of developing new clean energy things, transmission lines, but also wind farms and solar projects and all sorts of cool things like that. What are some other, like, what industry does this come from, or where has this idea been developed outside of data centers? Like, where has it worked? Where has it not worked so well?
Yeah, so I mean, I think again, the core concept and term, I think, is probably age old since people were in a village saying, you know, I'm gonna do something to you if you because you did something to me. Um, but I think it really was coined probably about 20 years ago here in Los Angeles, where I live, in connection to really some big stadium projects, urban redevelopment projects, with the concept that these were really big projects moving in and without protections and safeguards in place that were really specific. You know, the local communities were not going to necessarily get the jobs, and they weren't going to be the contractors, and they weren't going to get these good, you know, kind of workforce training opportunities. So at their core, they have tended to be around, really, I would say, like equitable workforce. Things like local hiring for disadvantaged communities, for women, and then really kind of like working out, you know, what other benefits will really kind of address these types of developments. So they've often been things like certain units of affordable housing, since they've been, you know, used in areas where gentrification could be an issue, or they're taking up, you know, kind of valuable land.
Awesome. Yeah, so really examples where there's a lot of employment associated with the project, I would say, like either in the construction phase or ideally with a stadium, that's going to be long-term employment for folks.
Yeah, I would say that's a bit of a distinction and why this use doesn't exactly fit, because really, you know, some of these pieces around having strong wages, workforce protections, and, you know, making sure that the folks impacted get these jobs, like, are a little mismatched with this type of use, which really does not create a lot of permanent long-term jobs.
Awesome. Okay. So what is one thing that you wish folks knew about community benefit agreements?
So I think there's a few things. So I guess the first is it's really not a tool to stop a project. And in fact, the benefits usually flow once the project is operational. So, you know, often it is a certain financial commitment into a fund that's out of a revenue stream, like a power purchase agreement. Um, so that's one thing. The second is really kind of like knowing you do give up your right to sue. So that is something to be taken carefully. It's something to not be done unilaterally. So the scale of data center impacts and water and air and economics and all these pieces really mean that, like, there's a potential if one group moves forward, they could undercut a lot of other work that's in place. So it really should be a coalition. And then also, I guess I would say, like, know your worth. So these are really capital intensive projects with a lot of really major impacts that will be very long term to your community, to your children, to your environment. Understand walking in, you know, these are large corporations that are generally getting very generous state tax breaks and also local tax breaks. Um, they want you to not sue them and support them for one reason or another, and know that. And then I think the other piece to just know is when they have been successful, like, you know, the model is really strong, diverse coalitions that have built over multiple decades sometimes into like what we want as a community, all this stuff. This is not in this time where they're moving super rapidly. Like, you don't really have that opportunity. Um, And to get there in either of those places, you need the same things, which are organizing, coalition building, and legal leverage. So even if at the end you're like, ultimately, we might want a community benefit agreement or something that looks like that to get, address project impacts and get a fund, like probably the way you get there is going to look the same. You're going to organize, you are going to oppose, you are engaged with your local decision makers as hard as you can. You're going to find your legal leverage. And the stronger agreement you get is because of that. If you sit around and are nice, like you're probably not going to get a strong agreement at the end.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. Yeah, don't be too nice. That's a lesson. So quick question, because you and I are both lawyers, but like what kind of lawsuit, what sort of legal right are people giving up? Like what kind of lawsuit would you bring if you didn't do a community benefit agreement?
I mean, I think that is like entirely dependent on your project, right? Like, is there endangered? I mean, we don't a state endangered species claim. Is there a local environmental review or state environmental review claim? I think what's important, I would like turn that question back a little bit, is that legal right you're giving up should be very narrow when you draft it. So, you would want to draft it to this project only. A lot of these projects are, we think, going to have additions or expansions. This should be really narrowly not including expansions. It should be as the project is described and permitted now. It should also be really clear that if there are any permit violations or environmental or workforce violations down the road, like you're not giving up a right to sue that.
Hmm. Yeah, and I mean, just to the point you just made, I was talking to someone in Iowa today, and Microsoft put uh, data center in the Des Moines area that was the biggest data center Microsoft has ever made. And they keep adding to it, right? They can always add new buildings on as long as they can either build sideways or up. So yeah, you need to know what you're bargaining over in order to get a good bargain. Real quick before we go very specifically to like the specifics of doing this with data center developers, can we talk about like the community? What is the community a unit of government? Like who speaks on behalf of the community? Who is the community that's getting the benefits?
Yeah, and this is an extra confusing question because community benefit agreement is both used to apply to, I think, has how we tend to think about it, which is like a diverse coalition of community groups, including labor and low income community groups and faith, and actually just your local government. And I think increasingly what we see in the data center space is a community benefit agreement that's probably more like a development agreement. Isn't bad. It's just an agreement between a local government and the developer and community groups as we think of them trying to figure out or needing to figure out how to insert their goals into that process. I think the other things to think about in a community benefit agreement, anyone, but I really like particularly with this type of use and the scale and breadth of the impacts, is really everyone should be consulted as much as you can before you start that negotiation. So, I mean, as we talked about, there's energy, climate, air, water. You're probably economic risks from taking a tax base out of production, your school, which might lose revenue. Like, I think with a use of this scale and impact, it's really even more critically important to have all of those voices at the table to identify, their concerns and really what they would want to see for this project to move forward and to be really like just extra sensitive about that because this decision could have such far-reaching ramifications.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a weighty task to take on for sure, and you need a lot of people at the table to do it right. So now let's talk about CBAs in this industry. How do you think that the community benefit agreement model needs to be modified for data centers? And you've touched on some of this already. And if you want to also talk about sort of the idea of reciprocity and right sizing the agreement to the scope of the impact on the community.
Yeah. So I think just like understanding from the get-go, you know, because of the scale and breadth of this impact, there are other pieces to pursue that might not be in agreement. And I think also understanding that these agreements are vehicles. So they're really only as good as what's in them, right? So, a data center comes to town and you say, like, my goal is a CBA, and you're like, cool, I got a CBA, and that could be like $20,000, and this is a $20 billion project. So I think that's one thing to think about. I think there's a few other things to think about. I was on a meeting with a local government, and really they said something that was I found very impactful, which was, we don't want these. Like, this community benefit agreement, like, yeah, that makes great sense. Like, we could get like a sign for a little league or a better lighting system, but this is not something that matches that. And I think if these agreements are going to move forward, and I think they will in different forms, any of the economic benefits really need to be proportional to the project, its value, and its impact. And I think this is, we hear on the news and we see these announcements that are like $20 billion investment. Um, our states are mostly not getting that back. Our local government is somewhat getting that back in a very haphazard way. So if there is going to be this development in your community, what's the reciprocity like? Are you really getting the share? And what does that look like, and how is that measured? So is that a percentage of the capital investment that's actually reasonable for what it means to host this? Is that, I think how the revenue from the compute might come down, which is pretty hard to really, I think, hard to understand at this moment in time. Or is it kind of like some sort of lease, mining or oil and gas model, which again is maybe more based on revenue sharing. But so I think of it in these two buckets. There's proportional economic benefits. Like, what would it take to make our community whole? And that also might not be a number. It might be just like, this is what we need as a community. Like, we know we need these things. So that's to one side. And then I think the second piece is, because we are really moving forward in this time of deregulation, where we don't have a lot of backstops from the federal government and the state government, I think these agreements have to have strong environmental protections in them, because in many cases they might be kind of like the only way to get there.
Yeah. Yeah, especially if you're talking about noise pollution, light pollution, and impacts on state listed species, right? Things that aren't necessarily just going to be the first thing that the permit for a warehouse would normally cover. Absolutely.
Mhm.
Um, so um, you talked about enforceability, and I think that brings us to a good point on mechanisms to make it more enforceable. Nobody wants to get into a deal with a developer and then find that they violated the deal. And oh boy, I have to file a lawsuit, and it's going to take years before I can enforce it, before I can recover anything. So I know that there are some things like community benefit ordinances, and then maybe you've already talked about this, but talk about sort of incorporating protections into permits after they've been negotiated by the community. Are there ways to make enforcement easier and work better for the community members?
Do you mean more than like, if you have a community benefits agreement, ways to make that more enforceable, or alternatives to that tool?
Either or. I don't know much about community benefit ordinances, but I'm just saying that, yeah, to the extent that there's a way to make enforcement easier for, when you're David versus Goliath, right? Like if you have to sue it out with a company that has billions of dollars to hire lawyers with, that's not going to be fun. So what sort of enforcement mechanisms can you work into these types of agreements? And then yeah, if it jives with that question I just asked, what about a community benefit ordinance, for example, that requires community benefits without necessarily having the same structure as the agreement?
Yeah. So I think Ellie has dropped in the chat the AI Now North Star Toolkit, and that has a lot of really good examples. I think community benefit ordinances and nuisance ordinances and pieces like that are really interesting tool, because they don't require you giving up the right to sue. So they're just applied evenly. Likewise, likely not to a particular use like a data center, but to a use over a certain dollar figure, for example. So any development coming into our community will have to, use water conservation or enter into a community benefit agreement. or use these kind of hiring and contracting practices. I think they're in a lot of ways a more interesting tool to pursue, particularly as communities are really kind of getting into the local ordinance game, and investing back in their local government through this process, because they don't require these kind of one-off negotiations. And we have a lot of history in the U.S. With states like California and Ohio and Michigan who've used that tool. I would say it also tends to miss proportionality. So, they'll often be tied to development over a certain dollar figure, but they'll not require you do a fund of a certain amount. So you can also end up with like somewhat haphazard outcomes. But I think as communities are kind of on the ground seeking ways to make these projects better or make sure that economic development coming to their communities is more sustainable, it's a really interesting thing to think of. And there are certain tools out there like local hiring, which are, I think still feasible to move forward in this context, and in the data center space could bring a lot of value. In
Awesome.
terms of how to make the agreements more enforceable, as mentioned, I think a best practice is to incorporate into another land use authorities, like to a governmental permit or approval. And also, like I would say, the core of it, one of the core pieces of the community benefit agreement is the steering committee and structure. So you have a strong, diverse steering committee. That's really worked out in advance, not necessarily the people, but who can nominate them or the characteristics you want them to have. And I'd say a lot of these negotiations are really around that. And then that creates a space to bring the disputes, before they might get to litigation. And in a good agreement has a lot of safeguards put into place, for the process and the steps and the penalties that might be put in place for not meeting certain of the obligations in the agreement.
Yeah, I think that structure is really important to know about. You're not just setting up an agreement and then just leaving it be and hoping everything works out, but you have an actual trustee entity that's there to resolve things if they go wrong. And you hope that you don't have to pull their permits, but if you have to, then their permits will get pulled and they will not be able to operate, which is sort of the stick that you need in order to um, have a balance of power across the different groups.
Yeah, I will just flag. So there are, because this is a long-term endeavor, it takes a lot of work to get there and it takes a lot of work to stay there. And, sometimes your interest might flag. So it is very important to have, I'd say, capacity funding at the front end, and then ongoing funding, for community members to participate in these processes over the years.
Oh, we might have lost Hudson. We'll give him a second.
We might be at Q&A time.
Yeah, if not, that we can certainly do that. All right. Oh, yeah. Looks like he might have. Okay. Well, thanks for hanging in there with us, folks. We'll keep it going. Yeah, if you think we're ready for Q&A, I mean, I'm certainly happy to turn it over to that, but um I'm not sure where we were on the questions, so give me one moment. We don't have a ton of let's see. Okay, that's great. We do have one here in the chat. Sorry, I'm trying to focus on too many things here. Thank you again for sticking with us. Okay, so we've got a couple questions here. One is at what stage in the process are CBAs usually negotiated? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So as mentioned, the best practice is to like start prepping really early, which we in many cases do not in data center world do not have that luxury. So from the coalition community perspective, kind of doing mapping, identifying who you want at the table, and then kind of working together to coalesce around like a set of asks. So the 10 things that are really important to you, air quality monitoring, green space, et cetera. So I think that's like sort of from the coalition side, starting early. In terms of when they are most used and usable, I mean, it's really because the leverage is usually the local permit or approval, it's around that. So whatever your major approval is, you probably don't want to go too early in getting that because your maximum leverage is that approval. Um, and that timing or what that approval can be can vary, but I think it's really important working in these spaces to have a really strong understanding of the different permits and approvals and intervention points.
Great, thank you. I know as you were mentioning earlier, a lot of our communities are being approached very early on in the process, even before application. So I think that's, kind of trying to balance when to do that. But I appreciate hearing kind of when a community has the greatest leverage is useful to know, not to go in too early on things. All right. Where have you seen the strongest community benefit agreement in Pennsylvania, or are there kind of
In
other
Pennsylvania.
examples
So
that come to
in
mind?
data centers or in the world?
Well, that's a good question. They just say in PA, Pennsylvania, so I'm
Oh,
not
I
sure.
don't know.
I assume this guest is from Pennsylvania.
So I would say I'm not very familiar with the CB. I think there haven't been a lot of like super public full community management agreements for data centers. So I'm working with a student right now who is doing interviews with local governments throughout the countries, hosting data centers. And, there are not that many that she's coming across. I think the trend is more a development agreement, which is with the host community and the developer. And I think those are not always, those have been really hard to track down. They might be called something different. They're often in the terms of an agreement themselves. I don't think I've seen any that are so strong. I think when you sometimes see strong, um, I think what has probably been strong is some of the outcomes that public utilities commissions around clean energy commitments or low income bill reduction. Those are really probably the product of a settlement agreement of folks working in those proceedings.
Great, thank you. And yes, it was about in data centers. So
Yeah. I mean, so I think the one example that's come across a lot that's from Pennsylvania is the city of Lancaster. And I don't think that is a super bad example. It is like a host community rather than like community groups. And, I would say that the finances don't seem that strong, but apparently there wasn't much leverage there. And then I think from the example that we tend to give, which is not necessarily a community benefit agreement, but is the Henrico County. There's a really good affordable housing trust that has a lot of community oversight in how those funds are used.
that's great. I know, yeah, data centers are so, well, this level of data center hyperscalers are so new, it's hard to, yeah, see good
And,
examples so far.
and also things are not always very public. So I think that in this space, in those agreements, generally, they're not, and that's the best practice to require them to be public, but it's not always the case. So I think there's things are happening that we're not always seeing. I think sometimes it might be payment in lieu of taxes or other things.
Yes, yeah. We've got a more specific question about what folks might be able to request. So could a region or a community request funds from developers to pay for homeowner solar panels and heat pumps that would, maybe then kind of help lower energy costs for those folks, for individual homeowners, and maybe, I guess, freeing up energy for data center use?
Yeah, I mean, I think that again, like the beauty of the community benefit agreement in its purest form is it doesn't really have to be tied to project impacts. It's what the community needs. So it moves you past the world of environmental mitigation. And I think again, in its early form in Los Angeles and other places, it was really seeking to address that the environmental permitting and mitigation process wasn't really thinking about things like equitable workforce development. So yeah, I think anything is on the table. I think those things are actually like particularly well suited to be on the table. Because if it is, it is tied to the electricity business, which the data center is in, they will have, they're often doing a good amount of upgrades or transmission or some sort of energy development there. So why not take advantage of that and provide those services to the community they're entering? I think that would be a great suggestion. Great idea.
Excellent. There were a couple other questions earlier on in the chat about kind of that angle of those kind of more local energy impacts. So great. Love to hear that. I'm not seeing any new questions here. I do see that we regained Hudson. I'm very glad about that.
I'm so happy y'all continued without me. But let's talk about taxes. What do you think about tax breaks, Sarah Friedman? Do you think that it makes sense to give a company a bunch of tax breaks and then try to get that money back through a community benefit agreement?
I do not. I mean, so as background, and maybe this was covered in earlier webinars, but I think it's something like 35 states are giving some degree of sales tax exemption, sales and use tax exemption for data center servers and equipment. And so what that means again is that big $20 billion investment, your government, your state government that really does need resources and capacity and funding, particularly in these times when there might be lower employment and decreased property values and no funding from the federal government, is really not capturing that back. So, and again, we're really also seeing this at the local level where developers are negotiating for certain abatements, or they might be choosing to go into areas where economic development may be incentivized by offering local tax abatements. And again, like I think the bit of a mismatch here with some of those tax incentives and tax abatements is they're really operating under like a more traditional economic development model where you bring in an industry and it creates direct jobs through employment and indirect jobs through like the folks working in the pizza shop. And we just don't see that with this use. So you're really kind of like giving away this important revenue, but you're not getting what you tend to get back in return. And I think there was some recent, kind of data. Ali mentioned Good Jobs First on just like what it takes, what subsidies like Virginia's giving for just like one data center job. And then likewise, what they're losing, right? Like Virginia walked away from $1.6 billion of revenue this year through their data center tax exemptions. So I think it's a bad trend. I mean, I'm so happy that states like Minnesota are really like kind of working on this and making strides. And I think we're seeing state houses across the country, folks like recognizing that this is not the type of economic development that you want to necessarily incentivize that way. Um, and yeah, I think the danger with community benefit agreements and payments in lieu of taxes and some of these other things is like they're just really haphazard. So you're it's really up to the negotiating power and acumen of the local government, who again is under resourced, probably new to this type of work, and is coming up against, some pretty sophisticated actors.
Hudson, you are on mute. We are plagued by tech things today.
Okay, I think I intentionally muted myself, but I was gonna say, as you said, it's a hot topic in Minnesota. Sarah Mooradian can say better than I can that I think we've already lost more than $100 million in taxes to our existing data centers, and none of them are hyperscale facilities. So we've already lost significant amounts of money because of these sale taxes, and the fact that it was walked back slightly last session, and now the companies have to pay taxes on electricity is a move in the right direction, but it's also we still have pretty big tax breaks. Um, uh, so, so assuming you get the tax issue taken care of and you want, this is my last question on money, I swear. And you want the money in a way that actually benefits the community and not the developer necessarily. Maybe it can benefit them both, a win-win, if you will. But should the community have to wait for the money? What is the best practice for how you fund a community benefit agreement? What's the best for actual sustainable development using the money you get from one of these companies?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say in the more traditional community benefit community benefit agreement space. A best practice again is to get capacity funding for the early stages, because like they do take a significant amount of work, and you do want to make sure that the folks that you want to be guiding these decisions, the people who are most impacted, members of low income communities, people who are not doing this professionally, have the resources to participate and to build that table. Um, and then usually there's some sort of capacity payments early, to get to the point where the revenue would start to come in, because, say this agreement is signed like before your big local approval, and then you're going to start construction, and then it's going to be a bit till you're operational and probably bringing in revenue. So whatever that revenue stream is usually will kick into effect once the project is operational, but you need some capacity funding along the way. And then also, as mentioned, like a best practice is really to like resource over the long term, because these infrastructure projects and steering committees are like 25-year-old things often. Like, how are you going to resource folks so they can continue to engage when they move on to a different organization or something else comes up in their lives? Um, yeah. And I would say that's probably like similarly going to be true with data centers. Um, it's a little funny because, I think from a community resource perspective, it's really helpful to probably have like a strong annual payment coming in. But because we really don't have a lot of insight into the annual revenue of data centers yet and what that's going to look like, and that could change many times, to me, it feels a little simpler to tie it to the capital investment, or receipt or a recording tax, something like that. And then also be really careful to capture back capital reinvestment. So, every 3 to 7 years, chip servers and equipments might change over, and that's again like a big $4 or $5 billion investment. Like, you want to make sure the community, government and community groups are capturing that as well.
Yeah. And that gets us to a really good non-money issue. So talk a little bit about what these agreements can cover in terms of decommissioning or, recommissioning. Like you said, a data center today might have chips to do one thing and have these customers, and then 5 years from now, it might be a totally different machine. It's not the same thing as a mine that continuously makes the same product over its entire lifetime. What can be achieved in terms of decommissioning or these upgrades in these types of agreements?
So I think the decommissioning, I think is one piece, and I think that could go in agreement. I think it also should go in your local and state permit, and really having a very strong decommissioning plan that's created now, and then a decommissioning bond that's really, again, proportional to the project value, to make sure that communities are not left doing environmental cleanup like they may have seen with mining or logging, other developments in the past. So I think that's one piece, and that could be in a CBA, but also it should just be everywhere. And then the second piece of how we kind of handle like that this technology is changing super fast, and I don't think anyone knows what it's going to look like in 5 years. But probably there will be something in the shell of a building that uses an enormous amount of power, is likely. I think that is just both really careful drafting in both the agreement and local legislation, ordinance, permits, state, and just kind of making sure, there's no loopholes in who the entities are, that it runs with the project, that there's no way that someone down the road can kind of get out of their obligations, because we don't really know I don't think anyone knows who that will be.
Mhm. Absolutely. We are running precariously low on time. I do want to ask what is up with diesel generators and what would happen if you don't have meaningful restrictions on them. If you don't want to answer that one, we have many more questions.
Well, I have, I don't know if my colleagues, John or Catherine, who wrote our amazing diesel generator report, are on. I think maybe John, they're each Minnesotans. John is a current Minnesotan. Um, and they could, oh, he's on the chat, but not as a panelist. So I don't know if we can un.
Oh, I cannot promote John right now. I'm so sorry, John. Okay, well,
Um,
everybody should check out that report because it's
Everyone
good.
should check out the report. I mean, I think at a very high level, and John, correct me, a huge trend we're seeing is use of like temporary backup diesel generators being used for primary power for demand response. I think the stat that John really uncovered in his research that sticks with me is that in Virginia, there's enough permitted diesel generators for data centers to power 20 million homes. And that in Virginia, there's only 4 million homes. So um, this is a crazy trend. And I think, really making sure that there's strong protections in place to make sure if they are used, they're tier 4, which is the most stringent environmental protections from the EPA, that they're really limited in the time and type of use they can do, hours per year and hours per day, or, kind of time of day. And then really kind of like pushing that they're not used for demand response and that there's a battery and other on-site renewable backup generation.
Awesome. Yeah, we've definitely seen in Minnesota a proposal for one data center with 600 megawatts of diesel generation, which is a generator the size of our one of our two nuclear power plants. And and those things do not just sit idly by. They have to actually be run in order for them to continue to work, which was something that we learned a lot about without the benefit of John's great report. So yeah, I think we've covered a lot of topics. I would encourage folks who are still with us to check out the email that we send out afterwards because it will include some slides you didn't see. Sarah was wonderful enough to let us use some slides she used from a different presentation that's sort of a checklist of things to think about while you're getting ready to negotiate a community benefit agreement. So as she said, it's a tool that doesn't solve all ills. It's not a panacea, but if you're going to do it, you'll see in the slides shared from this presentation some important considerations that you'd want to cover as well. I don't know, Sarah, if you want to say anything about the process of establishing a CBA while we still have a couple minutes.
Um, I guess I would just say it's really resource intensive. I think it takes a lot of, takes legal capacity, it takes organizing capacity, it takes engagement in a lot of different permitting processes. Um, in today's time, it may be that is, particularly in terms of deregulation, like a private agreement with developers where you're going to get certain outcomes, but it's probably not the first place to go with this most extractive use.
Okay. I also see that John has been promoted to a panelist. So, John, do you want to say anything about diesel generators while we have you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Sarah gave a really good brief summary of our report. But yeah, I think the thing to emphasize with diesel generators, just kind of going back to your comment on the 600 megawatt capacity at one data center, is that, yeah, these generators have to be run, 10, 20, 30 hours a year just for maintenance and testing. And when you get that much diesel generator capacity, um, you end up getting emissions just from those maintenance hours up to similar to the levels of like a major power plant. Um, so these can have really huge health impacts, and it's really variable too, just based on if they start to be used more for demand response programs, or if there's more grid outages due to heat waves and other emergencies related to climate change. All of that could really increase these health impacts to a level that um, becomes a lot more burdensome to the local communities.
And I'll note that when we were fighting against that diesel generator Armageddon, all the developer said was, we'll follow federal regulations for emergency generators, which did not comfort me one bit. Um, okay, well, I thank you all for sticking with us. There have been a bunch of great resources dropped in the chat. I hope that everyone has a lovely evening. And hey, Feel free to write us back when you get the summary email on any other webinar topics you'd like to see on data centers. This is our fifth, and all of the others, and soon to be this one, are available as recordings. We really hope that you get some use out of them, and that you can use this to inform your communities about data center impacts and ways you can make this type of development better for you, or address the things that are not good. Thank you so much, Sarah, for being our wonderful expert on this topic, and I'm sorry so much, or to everybody, for taking up so much time with my questions. Yeah, thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
All right. Thanks, everybody.